Growing up in the 90s and being a baseball fan, King Griffey Jr. was always one of my heroes. I wanted to play baseball like him because he was the coolest to play baseball. I wanted to swing the bat like him because he was the best at swinging the bat. I wanted to play center field like him because he was the best center fielder. Um, but I have to think, if I grew up in a different time, like let's say ancient Israel, um, one of my heroes probably would have been King David, right? King David was the kid that killed a giant. He was the greatest king Israel had ever seen. He was a man after God's own heart. And yet, how does the saying go? Never meet your heroes, because they can never live up to your lofty expectations, right? The picture of this man that you have in your head is never going to be what that man actually looks like in real life. And I think we get a clear picture of that in Second Samuel. Second Samuel tells the story of David. It continues the story of David that you get in First Samuel. But you get a couple of stories that make you realize that although David was a great man, he did some amazing things. He was a man after God's own heart. Uh, he was just a man, guys. He made mistakes. He made some big mistakes. You read in 2 Samuel chapter 11 the story of David and Bathsheba. If you don't know, Bathsheba was a married woman. David saw her, was greatly infatuated with her, and took her as his own. When he finds out that she's pregnant, he has her husband murdered. Uriah, her husband, was murdered because of David. And so you start to realize, okay, David had some issues, right? And then you read the story of David and his son Absalom. Okay, and in chapter 18, you get this death scene where Absalom is killed. And leading up to that, David had opportunities to I think save Absalom and to show Absalom that he cared for him, he loved him, and yet he missed those opportunities. And it's not till the very end, after Absalom is dead, that you get this crying out in verse 33 from David. He says, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son, my son." David was not a perfect man. He loved his son, and yet he wasn't a good father to his son. Okay? He loved Bathsheba, and yet he took her when she was already married and had her husband murdered. David was not this perfect man. And yet that picture that we see in 2 Samuel gives me hope, right? Because, too often we read these Bible stories and we think, I could never be like Peter. I could never be like Paul. I could never be like David. And yet the author of 2 Samuel definitely shows us you can be like David. You can be a man after God's own heart, or a woman after God's own heart. Okay? Because look at David. David made these huge mistakes, and yet God still called him a man after his own heart. I know, guys, that we are imperfect. I know that we made mistakes. But here's the thing. The people in this Bible, apart from one, okay, they made mistakes too. Peter made all sorts of mistakes. Paul made all kinds of mistakes. He murdered Christians, for crying out loud. And yet these are the biblical heroes that we look up to. They're not perfect. They are very flawed men. And that gives me hope because I know I am not perfect. I know that I've made mistakes, and yet God takes imperfect people and uses them to do great things. So remember that as you go throughout your day, throughout your week, God can take imperfect people and use them to do great things. I pray that this has brought you joy, that this has brought you comfort. And just remember that as great as David was, he wasn't perfect, but he still did some amazing things. Thank you, guys.